In June of 1978, the snow finally pulled back from a ridge in the Plumas National Forest. And there, deep in the trees, stood a small Forest Service trailer that no one had checked in months. Something inside it had been waiting. The man inside was Ted Weir, 32 years old. He lay on a bunk, wrapped in bed sheets, wasted down to almost nothing. He had, according to investigators, starved to death. But here is where it stops making sense. The trailer was stocked. Shelves and cupboards held enough food to last him for months. There was fuel to burn, a way to stay warm. Everything a starving man could need was within his reach. So why didn't he eat? Why didn't he light a fire? A man locked in a cabin full of food and heat, slowly wasting away for weeks on end. The evidence suggested he had lived as long as 3 months up there, alone, or nearly, and Weir was missing his shoes. His feet were bare. Yet this trailer sat 20 miles from where his friends had left their car. 20 miles, on foot, into the high Sierra winter. 5 men drove into these mountains that February. How did one of them end up here? To understand how 5 grown men ended up starving in a snowbound forest, you first have to understand who they were, and how gently the world had always held them. Their families had a word for them. They called them the boys. There were 5 of them, all young men from Yuba County, California. Bill Sterling, 29. Jack Hewitt, 24. Ted Weir, 32. Jack Madruga, 30. And Gary Mathias, 25. Each carried something that set them a little apart. 2 of them, Weir and Hewitt, lived with intellectual disabilities. 2 others, Sterling and Madruga, were what people around them informally called slow learners. Madruga, like Mathias, had served in the army. But none of them lived the way most men their age did. They lived in Yuba City and nearby Marysville, scattered across a handful of tidy family homes. And every single one of them still lived with his parents. No apartments of their own, no wives. Their mothers still woke them for the day. Outside of their families, the 5 had each other. When they got together, it was almost always for one reason. Sports. A game to watch. A game to play. Basketball, most of all. It was the thread that tied the whole group together. These were men their parents watched over closely, men who needed rides and reminders and someone to lay their clothes out. Which makes what happened next so hard to square. Because 5 men this carefully kept would somehow vanish into the mountains, together in the dark. Of the 5, one carried a heavier history than the others. Gary Mathias was 25, and the label, slow learner, never fit him. His story didn't begin in Marysville. It began an ocean away, in uniform. In the early 1970s, Mathias was stationed in West Germany. Somewhere between the drills and the long nights far from home, he developed substance issues. What began as trouble on a base would follow him for the rest of his life. The problems deepened into something clinical. Army doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He was given a psychiatric discharge and sent back to the parents' home in Marysville, California, where he began treatment at a local mental hospital. The early years back home were hard. According to reports, he was nearly arrested for assault twice. Psychotic episodes landed him again and again in a Veterans Administration hospital. How do you build a life when your own mind keeps turning on you? But by 1978, something had shifted. He was being treated as an outpatient, on trifluoperazine and benzatropine, 2 medications that steadied him. He worked alongside his stepfather in the family gardening business, hands in the soil, days with a rhythm. His own physicians described him with quiet pride as one of our sterling success cases, a man who had come back from the edge. Stable, trusted, nearly whole, which is exactly why what came next would make no sense at all. By early 1978, Mathias had built something steady, and part of that steadiness was the 4 friends he saw when the workday ended. On the court, they had a name: the Gateway Gators. The Gators played through a local program for people with disabilities. For men called the Boys their whole lives, this was different. Here, they weren't slow. Here they were teammates, and they were about to play for something real. On the morning of February 25th, the Gators were due to open a week-long Special Olympics tournament. The prize for the winners? A free week in Los Angeles. For 5 men who lived at home with their parents, that was the trip of a lifetime. They took it seriously. The night before, some of them laid out their uniforms, folded and ready by the bed. They asked their parents, plainly, to wake them up on time. They did not want to be late. Every detail we know says these were men who intended to be home before dawn, sleeping in their own beds, so their mothers could shake them awake for the biggest game of their lives. Men with everything to look forward to, and not one of them ever came home. Before any alarm could ring the next morning, there was still that Friday night, and a decision no one in their families could ever explain. The boys weren't tired. They wanted a game. UC Davis was playing an away game against Chico State that same night, 50 miles north. So they piled into Jack Madruga's car, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego coupe, and pointed it up the valley in the dark. It was cold in the upper Sacramento Valley that time of year, the kind of night that bites through a thin jacket. And that's all the boys had on. Light coats, nothing more. Nobody was dressing for the weather. They were dressing for a basketball game. Madruga was one of only 2 in the group who could legally drive. He knew this road, this route, this 50-mile stretch of familiar valley. Chico State's campus sat at the end of it, and the Davis team they'd come to cheer for won that night. 50 miles north of home, a win in their pocket, 5 friends in a warm car, with a game to play in the morning. Everything about that night pointed south again, back toward Marysville, back toward their beds. And yet, the scoreboard had barely gone dark before the 5 of them piled back into the Montego, still buzzing from the wind. But instead of pointing the car south toward home, Madruga drove a short distance into downtown Chico, to a corner grocery called Bear's Market. It was just before 10. The clerk was already moving through the closing routine, wiping counters, counting the register, killing time until she could lock the door. Then, 5 grown men crowded in through the entrance at once. She would remember them later, and not fondly. A large group filing in at the last minute meant her tidy plan for the night was ruined. She was annoyed. That irritation is the reason we know they were there at all. They bought the kind of things men buy when a night is going well, and there is nowhere they have to be yet. Snacks, bottles of soda, cartons of milk. Nothing that speaks of danger. Nothing that speaks of the mountains. Then they carried their bags out into the cold, climbed back into the Montego, and pulled away from the curb. It was a little after 10 on the night of February 24th, 1978. No one who knew them would ever see them alive again. By 10 that night, the milk and sodas were paid for, and the Mercury pulled out into the dark. It was the last time anyone would sell them anything. Their parents had left porch lights burning, waiting for headlights that never turned into the driveway. Morning came, and the alarm clocks did their job. The uniforms were still laid out, folded and ready. But the beds the boys had asked to be woken from were empty, and had never been slept in at all. These were men who never missed a game, who set out their shoes the night before, who begged to be woken on time. And now the biggest morning of their year had arrived, and not one of them was home. The parents began calling each other. Then they called the police. 2 counties took the call: Butte, where Chico sat, and Yuba, where the men lived. And the search seemed simple enough. 5 grown men in a turquoise Mercury had driven 50 miles up a straight, familiar highway. retrace the road, find the car. So officers drove the route the men had taken. Gas stations, shoulders, ditches, the parking lot outside the market where they'd bought their snacks. Mile after mile of the obvious path home. And they found nothing. No car, no wreck, no sign 5 men had ever passed that way. The direct route gave the searchers nothing. Not a stalled car, not a dropped wallet, not a single witness along the 50 miles of Valley Highway. And then, days into the silence, a Plumas National Forest Ranger read the missing persons bulletin. He remembered something. On February 25th, the morning after the men vanished, he'd driven past a turquoise and white Mercury Montego parked along the Oroville-Quincy Road, high in the Sierra Nevada. At the time, it hadn't struck him as strange at all. Why would it? Locals drove up that road all winter to reach the cross-country ski trails that laced the ridges. One more car parked in the trees meant nothing. Just weekend skiers chasing fresh snow. He drove on and forgot it. But now the picture had changed. The bulletin, the photograph, the description of the car. It matched. On February 28th, the ranger led sheriff's deputies back up the winding road, into the high forest, to the exact spot he remembered. And there it sat, the Montego, right where he'd seen it 3 days before, nose deep in the snowpack, 70 miles from Chico. 70 miles the wrong way. Not toward Yuba City. Not toward home. Straight up into the mountains. 5 men who'd driven north to watch a basketball game. 5 men expected at a tournament the next morning. Instead, their car had climbed a dirt road into freezing wilderness, in the dark, in light coats. And of the men themselves, there was no trace at all. The deputies who followed that ranger up the mountain expected the worst. A wreck. A ditch. Some sign of the accident that had swallowed 5 men. Instead, the Montego sat quietly in the snow, upright and undamaged, as if the boys had just stepped out. The doors weren't jammed. The windows were intact. No blood, no struggle, no broken glass glinting in the frost. When investigators looked closer, the car itself became the first riddle. It was in good working order. Nothing was wrong with it at all. The Mercury was stuck in a low patch of snowpack, but only just. Investigators later concluded a couple of grown men could have rocked it free and driven straight back down the mountain. So why did 5 of them walk away from a car that still ran? Inside, the story got stranger. There were the empty wrappers from Bear's Market, the crushed soda cans, the drained milk cartons. The last snacks 5 men would ever share, scattered across the seats like the remains of an ordinary drive home. There were programs from the game they'd cheered at hours earlier. And there, on the seat, something that made no sense at all. A road map of California, neatly folded, not crumpled, not torn open in a panic, folded as though it had never been needed. Think of what that map means. Men who never came to these mountains. A car pointed the wrong way by 70 miles, and a paper guide to the whole state sitting untouched on the seat. They had the way home in their hands, and they left it folded. A folded map, a working engine. Every clue inside that Mercury pointed to men who were fine. But look at where the car sat, and the whole picture bends. Because none of it belonged on that mountain. Oroville-Quincy Road climbs into the Sierra Nevada, high and remote, 70 miles from Chico, and nowhere near any route home to Yuba City. To get there, the men drove hours in the wrong direction, deeper into the dark. Madruga's parents were certain of one thing. Their son hated the cold. He had never once driven up into these mountains. So why would he point his car uphill on a freezing February night, in a light coat with no reason on earth? Sterling had been up here once, years before. His father took him to a fishing spot near where the car was found. The younger man hated it. He stayed home when his father returned. This place held nothing for any of them. Their families sat with detectives and offered nothing. Not a guess, not a theory, not a single reason the boys would climb a winding dirt road into that wilderness. 5 men who lived their lives close to home had driven straight into a place that made no sense at all. For 3.5 months, the mountains kept their answer. The winter that made no sense sealed everything under snow. Then, in June of 1978, the drifts along the high ridges began to soften and pull back. The forest that had swallowed 5 men began, slowly, to give a few of them back. Scattered across the wooded slopes off the Oroville-Quincy Road, searchers started finding what the winter had hidden. Not much. Just fragments. What they recovered were bones. Only bones. Jack Madruga, 30. Bill Sterling, 29. Jackie Hewitt, 24. 3 of the boys who had driven off to a basketball game, reduced by months of exposure and by scavenging animals to scattered remains on the forest floor. The animals had done their work through the long winter, pulling the remains apart and dragging them across the ground. Some of what belonged to one man was found a distance from the rest, piecing together who became grim, careful work. And here was the first cruelty the terrain revealed. These 3 had not fallen near the car. They were found miles up into the wilderness, deeper along the ridge, further from the road, further from any road at all. Why would they have kept climbing? 3 of the men accounted for, in the worst possible way. But investigators counted the recovered and came up short. 2 names had no bones. Ted Wire was still out there somewhere. And so was Gary Mathias. The bones told a fast, brutal story. But 20 miles north of the abandoned car, inside a locked Forest Service trailer, investigators found something that told a slower one. A man who had not died quickly at all. Ted Wire lay on a bed inside, wrapped in sheets. His body had wasted away. According to the coroner's findings, he had lost an enormous amount of weight, his beard grown long. He had starved, slowly, over weeks. Here is what makes it unbearable. Inside that trailer and nearby, there was food, canned goods, enough to keep a man alive for months. There were matches and fuel and books that could have fed a fire. He used almost none of it. The coroner estimated Wire may have lived as long as 3 months after the men were last seen. 3 months in that trailer, surrounded by heat he never lit and food he barely touched. Why would a starving man refuse to eat? And there was the detail no one could explain. Ted Wire was found without his shoes. His feet, some reports noted, showed signs of frostbite. Yet a pair of shoes sat inside that same trailer. They were not his. They belonged to Gary Mathias. Think what that means. Mathias's shoes in the trailer. Wire's gone. Someone had been there beside him. Someone who could still walk out. Which raises the question the searchers could not shake. Where was the 5th man? And had he simply left Ted Wire to die? Those missing shoes were the clue that Wire didn't die alone up there. And months before anyone reconstructed his final weeks, another man had already tried to tell police what he'd seen in that same stretch of forest. He was a local man, driving the same mountain road that February night. His own car had trouble, so he pulled over, deep in the trees, and settled in to wait out the dark hours alone. And that's when he heard them. Voices, he told police. People moving around his car in the freezing dark. Then he saw the light, flashlight beams, sweeping across the snow, coming closer. So he did the natural thing. He called out. Twice, according to his account, he shouted for help into the dark. And each time, the answer was the same, nothing. The moment he called out, the voices stopped. The flashlights went dark. Whoever was out there fell silent and vanished into the trees, as if they wanted to be unseen. Why would people in the wilderness hide from a man offering help? He never got a look at their faces, but he'd stopped only a short distance from where the Montego was later found, and the bodies lay miles beyond that. So how did 5 men cover ground like that on foot, and who was hiding in the dark? That witness account, the flashlights going dark, the silence that followed a cry for help, is where one theory takes root. If someone was out there that night, someone deliberately quiet, then maybe the men never chose that mountain at all. Foul play. It's the explanation that answers the distances no one else can. How does a car end up 70 miles from Chico, deep on a road these men had no reason to know? And how does a body travel 20 miles from that car? But foul play struggles with what it cannot explain. There was no ransom, no bodies dumped together, no sign of a struggle in the car. Just wrappers, a folded map, and men who seem to leave on their own. What kind of crime looks like this? So others turn to a quieter, colder theory. No stranger at all. Just 5 men stranded in the snow, in light coats, with a working car they inexplicably left behind. And what the freezing body does to the mind. Hypothermia does strange things. In its late stages, some victims tear off their own clothes, convinced they're burning up. Some crawl into tight spaces and hide. Investigators know this. Could that explain the shoes, the wandering, the impossible choices? And beneath every theory sits the thing no one can measure. 4 of these men had intellectual disabilities, or were called slow learners. Facing a car stuck in snow in the dark, would panic have overtaken the sense to simply push it free? Then there was Gary Mathias. Schizophrenia, controlled by medication that night's cold, would soon leave far behind. In a crisis, on a mountain, in the dark, whose judgment did the others follow? Every theory circles back to him, and every one of them falls short. Every theory eventually collides with the same silence, because at the center of all of them stands one man who was never accounted for. 4 bodies came out of that forest. Gary Mathias never did. The man his doctors called one of their sterling success cases, the veteran who had clawed his way back from schizophrenia and disability, the only one besides Madruga who could even drive that car. And then, nothing. No body. No trace. But the trailer held one detail that refuses to let him rest. Ted Weir's shoes were gone. And sitting inside that same trailer, left behind, were Gary Mathias' own shoes. Why would he trade his shoes for a dead friend's? Did he take Weir's, then walk out into the snow to find help? And if he left that trailer alive on his own 2 feet, where does a grown man simply vanish to? Searchers combed that country. The snow gave up 4 of them and kept the 5th. To this day, Gary Mathias has never been found. No confirmed remains, no answer, no goodbye for the family who called them the boys. 5 friends drove north for a game and turned, for reasons no one has ever explained, up a frozen mountain road they had no reason to climb. 4 never came home. 1 never came back at all. And somewhere in those Plumas pines, the answer may still be waiting. What do you think happened to Gary Mathias and the Yuba County Five? Tell me in the comments and subscribe to stay with the Unsolved.